In our headlines on this Monday afternoon, March 20th here in Seoul. Face masks are no longer required on public transportation here in Korea, where authorities have announced fewer than 4,000 COVID-19 infections today. North Korea's Kim Jong-un reportedly oversees an exercise simulating a nuclear counterattack this past weekend as he calls for the country's readiness to deter war. South Korean auto exports hit $5.6 billion in February, up some 47% on year, to record a fresh monthly high on the back of electric vehicles. As promised last week, there has been a further tangible ease in COVID-19 related restrictions, with face masks on public transport lifted as of this Monday. Now, that being said, my colleague Kim Jong-sil was out and about to gauge the public response. To take a look.
Starting March 20th, people in South Korea can ride trains or buses without having to worry about masks. The government announced last Wednesday that it will now leave it to people to decide for themselves whether to wear a mask when using public transport. We went to find out what people in South Korea decided to do on the first day of these more relaxed rules. I'm at Sadang Station on subway line number 4, and as you can see behind me, the majority of the passengers are still wearing masks. But there were a few people who didn't wear a mask.
It's not that I'm not worried about COVID-19, but now that everyone's gotten it and I've had it once before, I figured it would be okay to take my mask off at this point.
For about 2 years and 5 months, people in South Korea had to wear a mask when using public transport, so some passengers said they are used to wearing it. Most of the people at this bus stop were also wearing masks.
I'm wearing the mask because it's not that uncomfortable anymore, but starting today, I'll also take my mask off.
Trains and buses aren't the only places people can now go without wearing masks. On Wednesday, the government also said that masks won't be required in specific types of pharmacies, the ones located inside supermarkets or stations. Before, people could be shopping right nearby, but then put their masks back on when using the pharmacy in those places. The government gave two main reasons for its decision. One is that even after the first stage of the indoor mask mandate was lifted back at the end of January, which allowed people to go to most indoor places without masks, the number of COVID-19 cases has been dropping. Another is that many people in South Korea were still wearing masks even without a mandate. Only a few places remain that require masks: regular pharmacies, hospitals, and care facilities. South Korean health officials are likely to consider lifting the mask mandate in all places only after the World Health Organization announces that COVID-19 is no longer a global emergency. Kim Jong-sil, Arirang News.
President Yoon-Kishida sat down for his weekly meeting with Prime Minister Han Duck-soo on this Monday after speaking with top secretaries earlier in the day. High on the agenda were follow-up measures to his summit with Japanese Prime Minister Yoon-Kishida in Tokyo last Thursday. Speaking of which, the top office here has described the recent presidential trip to the neighboring country a success. Earlier on Sunday, Lee Do-eun revealed that follow-up measures include a visit to Japan by lawmakers from the ruling People Power Party. He also urged members of the opposition parties to join the planned trip. Expectations are also high for private sector trade exchanges between the two countries. Across the border in North Korea, Kim Jong-un has called for a counter-attack posture with nuclear weapons to reportedly avert aggression. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Kim Hyun-sung reports.
North Korean leader Kim Jong-un called for the regime to stand fully ready with nuclear attacks to deter war, in a remark made during a military drill over the weekend. The North state-led Korean Central News Agency reported on Monday morning that North Korean troops on Saturday and Sunday trained to improve their nuclear attack skills in a 2-day course. Kim Jong-un oversaw the training and again brought his daughter along, who seems to be Kim Jong-un's protege. Kim added in his statement that simply having nuclear weapons is no longer enough to deter war. The North must strike fear to enemies by becoming ready with its nuclear attacks. And on Sunday morning, North Korea fired another short-range ballistic missile from Cheolsanggun Pyeongbuk-do province off toward the East Sea as part of its training, KCNA said. It added that the missile achieved its target by flying 800 kilometers to blow up 800 meters above the sea. It also said the drill did not in any way harm the safety of neighboring countries. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff also confirmed on Sunday that they detected a short-range ballistic missile flying for about 800 kilometers and fired off toward the East Sea. This missile firing comes in the middle of Freedom Shield, the 11-day-long Seoul-Washington joint drill. North Korea has been protesting against these war games by ramping up its weapons tests and increasing hostility in their rhetoric. The KCNA mentioned the North's discontent at American strategic assets being deployed to South Korea for the joint military training, and said that this training is also to send a stronger warning to Seoul and Washington as they continue with their exercises. Kim Hyun-sung, Arirang News.
Right, and speaking about those military exercises, South Korea and the U.S. are conducting their largest maritime landing exercise in 5 years. As part of the broader Freedom Shield exercise, the Ssangyong training is taking place in the port city of Pohang for the next 2 weeks, starting from this Monday. Previously, Korea's Marine Corps had said the training would involve contingency procedures such as clearing mines, providing fire support at amphibious landing locations, and conducting air and maritime assault operations. As opposed to the former brigade-level drills, this year's training includes division-level amphibious landing forces, assault ships, and fighter jets. Also, British Marine forces will be taking part in the training for the first time. Meanwhile, the international community has renewed its condemnation of North Korea's reckless brinkmanship in response to Sunday's launch of a short-range ballistic missile. Our Foreign Ministry correspondent Pei Eun-ji reports.
Foreign ministers of the G7 nations, including the U.S., the U.K., and Japan and the EU, condemned yet another missile launch by North Korea in the strongest terms, saying it undermines regional and international peace and security. In a statement released by the U.S. State Department on Sunday local time, the foreign ministers said they deeply regret inaction by the UN Security Council because of, quote, obstruction by some members. Although not named, the statement apparently referred to China and Russia, who have blocked recent efforts to impose tougher sanctions on North Korea. They added that North Korea's reckless behavior demands a swift and unified response from the international community, and called on all UN member states to fully implement all UN Security Council resolutions. Following Sunday's missile launch, the top nuclear envoys of South Korea, U.S., and Japan also condemned Pyongyang's latest provocation and discussed their coordinated responses. Seoul's foreign ministry said Kim Gun, the special representative for Korean Peninsula Peace and Security Affairs, held phone talks with his U.S. and Japanese counterparts, Sung Kim and Takehiro Funakoshi, where they called the North's actions a threat to peace and stability that clearly violates multiple UN Security Council resolutions. The three officials also agreed to build a firm and unified response against the North's provocations at the upcoming UN Security Council's meeting in New York on Monday. Pei Eun-ji, Arirang News.
Also on the international front, Chinese President Xi Jinping is poised to sit down with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Moscow to address a wide array of issues, including the war in Ukraine. Our Lee Seung-jae has the latest.
A visit for peace. That's what Beijing is calling the three-day visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to Russia to speak with his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin. The visit marks his first trip to Russia in 4 years and comes just over a year after Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. Beijing signaled earlier that Xi is trying to broker a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, and this visit may be the start of that. According to Putin's top foreign policy advisor Yuri Yushakov, the two leaders will hold an informal one-on-one meeting, followed by dinner on Monday, and hold negotiation talks on Tuesday. While the two sides will also discuss other matters, including economic cooperation, talks will likely mainly center on the possible peace deal. Xi is also expected to speak to Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky over the phone following his visit to Russia. Meanwhile, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the Russian president on Friday for alleged war crimes, with the court accusing Russia of the unlawful forced deportation of Ukrainian children. The Kremlin responded strongly to the arrest warrant, with Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov stressing that ICC decisions have no meaning to Russia, including from a legal point of view. While the arrest warrant won't likely put Putin behind bars at The Hague anytime soon, it will mean the ICC's 123 member states are obligated to detain and transfer Putin if he sets foot in their country or territory. Despite being a wanted man in the eyes of the ICC, Putin made a surprise visit to occupied Mariupol on Saturday. Mariupol had long been a symbol of Ukrainian resistance before control of the city was lost last May. Putin's trip to the city also comes on the back of the 9-year anniversary of Russia's annexation of Crimea. Lee Seung-jae, Arirang News.
Strong global demand for Korea's electric vehicles led to yet another record high in monthly auto exports in February. Our Lee Soo-jin reports.
The South Korean auto industry saw record high monthly exports in February. Data from the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Energy on Monday shows that outbound shipments of cars last month came to $5.6 billion. That's up around 47% from a year earlier. A total of more than 220,000 cars were exported, up almost 35% on year. The rise was mainly driven by the high demand for eco-friendly cars. Exports of eco-friendly cars rose nearly 62%, surpassing 60,000 units for the first time ever, with all types of environmentally friendly cars proving popular. The dollar value of these vehicle exports reached a record $2.02 billion, up 83.4%. The export value of eco-friendly cars has been on an upward trend since August last year, accounting for almost 40% of total car exports. The number of cars produced domestically also surged 30.2% on year to more than 343,000 units, with the improvement in chip supplies. South Korean auto giants Hyundai Motor and Kia posted strong results thanks to the global demand for eco-friendly cars. Exports of Hyundai's cars surged nearly 35% to more than 94,000 units, and Kia's nearly 58% to more than 96,000 units last month. Eco-friendly vehicles are also gaining popularity in Korea. Domestic eco-friendly car sales rose around 32% compared to a year earlier, making up 30.3% of overall domestic car sales. Meanwhile, exports of auto parts last month also jumped 13.3% as outbound shipments to major markets such as North America and the European Union rose. Exports of auto parts and cars combined came to $7.6 billion, making them the nation's top export product last month. Lee Soo-jin, Arirang News.
The number of South Koreans aged 15 to 29 who have decided to take a break from work or job seeking hit a record high in February. According to Statistics Korea, 497,000 people were economically inactive by choice, posting an all-time high since relevant data was first compiled in 2003. The economically inactive population normally includes those in pursuit of education, or those in child rearing, or those rendered unable to work. However, the latest group of the almost 500,000 people are reportedly taking a break from work obligations and related pursuits because they wish to. Brides here in Korea are now more likely to be in their early 40s than in their early 20s. According to the Korean Statistical Information Service, the number of marriages, including women aged between 40 and 44 last year, stood at 10,949. Now, this number is about 800 higher than the number of marriages for women aged between 20 and 24. This phenomenon reportedly began in the year 2021. It's also being fueled by a drop in population of women in their 20s and changing perceptions here about marriage itself. In a bid to better calm market jitters, Swiss banking giant UBS has sealed a deal to take over ailing lender Credit Suisse for more than $3 billion. Our foreign affairs correspondent Ssangyong has details.
Credit Suisse has been rescued by rival bank UBS in a government-supported deal. Swiss banking giant UBS on Sunday agreed to buy Credit Suisse for 3 billion Swiss francs, which is around $3.25 billion.
Bringing UBS and Credit Suisse together will build on the best skills available in the Swiss Financial Centre and enhance the combined organisation's ability to serve our clients and deepen our best-in-class capabilities.
We are happy to have a solution that I am convinced brings sustainable stability and security for our clients, employees, the financial markets and Switzerland.
The Swiss National Bank pledged a loan of up to 100 billion Swiss francs, or $108 billion, to support the takeover. The country's finance minister also announced that the government will grant UBS a guarantee worth 9 billion Swiss francs in order to reduce any risks for the bank.
You have to imagine this is like insurance, which only takes effect should there be any losses. First, UBS would cover those losses, and then in a second phase, the government.
The takeover comes in a bid to halt the banking crisis that has been sparked by the collapse of US-based Silicon Valley Bank and Signature Bank earlier this month. Credit Suisse has had issues with investor confidence for some years on the back of a number of scandals and financial missteps, and saw its share price drop to a low last week not seen since the onset of COVID-19.
The takeover of Credit Suisse by UBS is the best solution for restoring the confidence that has been lacking in financial markets recently.
The deal was welcomed by U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen and Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell. The Bank of England also said it welcomes the measures taken by Swiss authorities to support financial stability. Under the deal, Credit Suisse shareholders will receive 1 UBS share for every 22.48 Credit Suisse shares they hold. Choi Min-jang, Arirang News.
Here in Seoul, a landmark in the center of the city has been transformed into a cultural hub that shares Korea's advances on the cultural and technological fronts. Our Shin Se-byuk offers us a glimpse.
Gwanghwamun Square in central Seoul has been transformed into a new cultural hub of South Korea. What used to be Gwanghwa-sire, the media artwork displayed at Gwanghwamun Square, has now been rebranded as K-Culture Square, in line with the government's efforts to promote Korean culture to the overseas market.
As South Korean content garners global popularity, K-Culture Square showcases media arts and installations to celebrate Korea's cultural and technological progress.
The K-Culture screen installed on the exterior walls of the National Museum of Korean Contemporary History features various types of content. Right across the street from the digital signage, this K-Culture attraction offers an immersive journey back in time. Meet the Joseon Dynasty's legendary war hero, Admiral Lee Sun-shin. Using a panorama screen and a 4D motion chair, Lee's stories are brought to life after more than 4 centuries.
I think it was very interesting that you get to experience the battle as a first point of view rather than seeing in the pictures. So for that, I think it was very nice for him to experience as well, because he was very interested in Lee Sun-shin.
Interactive and immersive media artworks welcome commuters and pedestrians at K-Culture Museum inside Gyeongbokgung subway station. Visitors can enjoy a multi-sensory experience at the exhibition with sight, sound, and even touch. The exhibition's theme of recovery and meditation in a city center creates a peaceful oasis in the midst of bustling urban life, providing visitors with a much-needed escape.
It felt so calming, given that the arts are so in nature, and it's so unique given that there is no such thing as digital art in the Philippines. It's so amazing, and it's very different from the different museums that I've been to.
The Culture Ministry aims to promote K-content to both domestic and foreign tourists through K-Culture Square to enhance their experience of Korea's artistic and technological attractions. Shin Se-byuk, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. At least 19 people were killed and several others were left in critical condition when a bus carrying 40 passengers drove through a highway fence and crashed into a ditch. The crash occurred on Sunday morning local time in the city of Shipja, some 80 kilometers from the capital Dhaka. The cause of the crash is still being investigated, but authorities suspect that the driver lost control after a tire burst. Thousands of road deaths occur in the country every year, often the result of lax road safety laws, reckless driving and old vehicles. And despite the government's pledge to reduce road fatalities by 50% by the year 2030, traffic-related deaths in Bangladesh have continued to rise. Meanwhile, at least 16 people have been killed and hundreds have been injured after a 6.8 magnitude earthquake struck southern Ecuador and northern Peru on Saturday local time. According to the U.S. Geological Survey, the earthquake was more than 65 kilometers deep and its center was 80 kilometers south of Guayaquil, an Ecuadorian city of 3 million people. The brunt of the quake was felt in Ecuador, where 15 of the fatalities were recorded. There, at least 7 houses were destroyed and dozens of buildings damaged. Power lines were also downed, complicating ongoing search and rescue efforts. Peru also reported that the roofs of some houses collapsed. Moving over to Taiwan, where former President Ma Ying-jeou is set to visit mainland China for an 11-day trip from March 27th. It's the first time that a sitting or former Taiwanese leader will visit China since 1949, when the defeated Republic of China government fled to the island. It is not known whether Ma will meet with Chinese officials. The trip comes amid heightened tensions between Taipei and Beijing, as China has continuously claimed that Taiwan is part of its sovereign territory. Ma is a senior member of Taiwan's opposition Kuomintang Party, which favors better ties with China, but says it is not pro-Beijing. But the visit has been met with backlash from the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, which says that the KMT is too close to Beijing. And finally, New York City's Fifth Avenue turned green as the Big Apple held its 262nd St. Patrick's Day parade. Revelers on Friday moved from 44th Street up to 79th Street in a celebration that featured marching bands and performers. Usually celebrated on March 17th every year, the day commemorates St. Patrick and the arrival of Christianity in Ireland. People usually celebrate by wearing green, a color closely associated with Ireland. New York City's parade is one of the oldest and largest in the world, after starting back in the year 1762. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good afternoon. What a dusty day we are having today. The capital region is experiencing the worst level of ultra-fine dust, with an ultra-fine dust advisory issued in the capital region Chungcheongnam-do and Jeollabuk-do provinces. So emergency ultra-fine dust reduction measures are deployed in the capital region until 9 p.m. tonight. A dry weather advisory also remains in place across Korea. Gangwon-do province already had 8 wildfires break out this month so far. Fire safety and prevention is a must around this time of year, with no wet weather forecast for the area. Roller coaster temperatures continue, and low single-digit figures are reaching in the mid-teens in the central regions and the 20s in the southern provinces. Mostly sunny skies, but they will be blurred by the toxic dust, and the dust level will stay unbearable through tomorrow afternoon. Then a big warm-up is on the way for the capital area. Meanwhile, Jeju and the southern provinces will see welcome rain in the middle of the week. That's Korea for you, and here's a look at the international weather conditions.
Those are the headlines at this hour. We have our panel session coming up right after this break. Do stay with us. Thank you for now.
I'm live.
저를 도와주시는 분들이
저희와 함께 해주시는 세션분들
아무리 봐도 없지. 텐션 같은데 아니라고 아무도 안 하는 거고.
좋아요.
춥지 않은가요? 처음 태어난 이별에서 사는 우리 손잡아요.
Contour the world, simply contour. India, the United Kingdom, New Zealand. Woo!
I'm excited. You excited?
Of course.
Yeah.
Music, start.
부산항에 그리운 내 형제여
President Yoon-Kishida and Japanese Prime Minister Yoon-Kishida agreed to resume shuttle diplomacy last Thursday as they dined and drank in Tokyo, highlighting the importance of bilateral ties amid regional security concerns and global efforts to bolster supply chains. So how are pundits here assessing the latest summit between Seoul and Tokyo? What has been the response to the summit in neighboring Japan? And how close are the two neighbors to bridging their historical divide? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we revisit the summit between the leaders of South Korea and Japan last Thursday over in Tokyo, during which the two governments sought to renew their ties. For more on this, I have Professor Kim Hyun-wook from the Korea National Diplomatic Academy. Professor Kim, it's good to see you again.
Thank you.
I also have Michelle Ye-hee Lee, Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, live on the line over in Tokyo. Michelle, it's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
Right, Professor Kim, how do you assess last Thursday's summit between President Yoon-Kishida and Japanese Prime Minister Yoon-Kishida?
Well, I think the summit meeting came up pretty quickly, much earlier than I expected. I think this pretty well shows that the restoration of two countries' relationship is really, really important for now. Now there is a Russian invasion on Ukraine, and also the rise of China and ongoing North Korea's military provocations. So all these things are making the international situation pretty much confused. I mean, I think the need for a bilateral relationships and also trilateral cooperations amongst the U.S., Korea, and Japan is very important to deal with security issues in this region.
Right. And Michelle, what has been the general response over there in Japan regarding this latest summit between the two leaders?
Right. I hear from many Japanese officials and see in the public polling that people agree that improved bilateral relations and trilateral cooperation in general is a good idea. And there's very cautious optimism about that working out. You can see that cautious optimism reflected in the polls. Asahi Shimbun just did a poll over the weekend, and 63% of respondents in Japan appreciated President Yoon's visit, and 55% appreciated President Yoon's proposal on the forced labor issue. From the Japanese perspective, the question now is this actually going to work out, and is this going to have staying power? They're highly aware that any solution will need the backing of the Korean public as well as the Japanese public, and they're looking at that very carefully. And I hear from a lot of experts in Korea and experts in Japan-Korea relations who are based in Japan that President Yoon has gone out on a limb. He is making a politically risky decision, and that at the moment he has more to lose, and whether Prime Minister Kishida will respond with the corresponding measure.
Right. And Professor Kim, Japanese media reported on this Monday that Prime Minister Kishida had called on President Yoon to better tackle the issue of compensation for Korean women who had been forced into sexual slavery during Japanese colonial rule. That being said, back in the year 2015, there was a bilateral effort to better address this particular issue. What were the challenges back then?
I think the challenges actually came afterwards. During the Park Geun-hye government, the foundation was set up, the third-party foundation, to compensate for the comfort women. And Japanese government actually set up the endowment of 1 billion yen, which can be used for the compensation for the comfort woman. So that was the first achievement, I think. And second achievement, I think, at the time was that Prime Minister Abe's policy was contained in then Foreign Minister Kishida's pronouncement. So very clear apologies by Prime Minister Abe was expressed at the time. I think that was very important achievement of the agreement. And third point, I think, is a little bit problematic from the South Korean public opinion, is that Japanese government at the time pointed out that that agreement is a solution, a final and irreversible solutions of comfort woman issues. So those were I think the key contents of the agreement. But afterwards, during the Moon Jae-in government, because of the reason that the agreement did not really reflect much of what comfort women victims are expressing, they dissolved the third-party foundation, and the agreement itself pretty much was nullified so far. So I think we need to tackle on this. I mean, we might need to talk more with comfort women victims, and so that the agreement would be, much more effectively, implemented in the future.
Right. Michelle, speaking within your capacity as a journalist who has been covering the two countries, what are your prospects with regard to the two neighbours' efforts to perhaps better bridge their gap over historical differences this time around?
Well, I do think it's a little bit too early to tell because of these issues of credibility and trust and the historical baggage that both countries face when it comes to overcoming these very deeply rooted questions and issues and controversies. As Professor Kim mentioned earlier, Prime Minister Kishida was foreign minister in 2015, and he negotiated the Comfort Women Agreement with the Korean government at the time. So he's not starting from zero, and he has experience working with Koreans, and with that possibly comes hope and maybe a little skepticism as well. The Yoon administration has clearly wanted improved bilateral relations ever since the campaign trail. President Yoon has talked about this, and we saw during his speech on March 1st about the independence movement that it's time to move forward. He called Japan a partner. When he came to Japan, however, in the press conference, Prime Minister Kishida didn't go as far as calling Korea a partner. He did talk about wanting to improve the friendship and trust between the two countries. However, I do think in a way the two countries have the right leaders at the right time in both countries, as well as in the United States. President Biden is deeply committed to improving alliances and to shore up these relationships and make sure that everyone is working more closely together. Prime Minister Kishida has experience working with the Koreans, and President Yoon wants things to improve. So in one way, all the leaders are in the right place at the right time.
Right. Professor Kim, moving forward, Thursday's summit has also paved the path to normalizing a key military intelligence sharing pact with Japan, the GSOMIA. That being said, what is your outlook, Professor Kim, regarding Pyongyang's future course of action?
I think North Korea's behavior under a very serious and severe U.S.-China competition is a little bit different from the past. Past when U.S. and China was competing each other, North Korea was kind of wavering between two superpowers to maximize its national interest. But now it's a little bit different. I mean, because of COVID and domestic situations, China is not very, very, good at, giving aid and support to North Korea. And the U.S. doesn't really care about North Korea. So during the situations, North Korea, under a very solid North Korea-China relations, continues its military provocations. Of course, at the end of last year, when China, sent its, surveillance balloon to the United States, before that, China kind of attempted to expand a cooperation agenda with the United States, but because of balloon incident, that really didn't happen. So I think for now, what North Korea needs to do now is to continue its military provocations on and on, maybe heighten the level of, military provocations in a hope that U.S. or China can do something for North Korea. Which I don't think is really have a very high, possibility. But I think for now, North Korea, pretty much on the side of China, speaking for the interests of China, I think is pretty much criticizing, South Korea-Japan relationship restorations, and furthermore would criticize also the trilateral cooperations amongst the U.S., South Korea, and Japan.
Right. And given these regional security concerns, Michelle, is it only natural, perhaps, that Washington welcomes closer ties between Seoul and Tokyo?
Yes, I think so. And Korea and Japan are the two biggest allies in Asia of the United States. So I do think it's natural that the United States wants to see improved bilateral ties. I think it's also important to remember that the Biden administration came into this, his leader, the administration, really wanting to prioritize this because they wanted to show that they're different from the Trump administration. When former President Trump questioned the loyalty of allies, the impact of alliances and partnerships, and President Biden wanted to set that straight. On top of that, from the U.S. perspective, they believe that having the two allies get along is the way to increase security cooperation and is critical to a stronger trilateral relationship between the three countries. The U.S. believes that it could face geopolitical and economic issues together, and to do it together is the better way to go. They want to address China's rise, North Korea's missiles, like Professor Kim said, and on top of that, decreasing the supply chain dependence on China. So the U.S. obviously wants to see a stronger relationship between the two countries, between Korea and Japan, as well as between the trilateral relationship between U.S., South Korea, and Japan.
Right, and staying with what Michelle has just said, Professor Kim, how does closer collaboration among Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington look to affect Seoul's relationship with Beijing?
I think this definitely affects, China-South Korea relations. But before we talk about that, the current U.S.-China competitions and so-called a new Cold War systems is something that happens for now. I mean, it's from the perspective of allies and partners like South Korea, it is a zero-sum competition, which is not like the past. I mean, during the Trump government, also Trump, pressured China, but it was not a zero-sum. Trump did not push allies to sideline with the United States in pressuring China. But now what Biden is doing is to make the world to be divided between China camp and U.S. camp, and hey, South Korea coming to the U.S. side to deal with China. So this is something happening now. I mean, as one course of actions of the U.S. policy toward China, the Japan and South Korea relationship is restored, which I think will be expanded to the trilateral cooperations, which I think will pretty much in detail to deal with some policies like decoupling with China on high-tech industries. Also security issues, these trilateral cooperation will deal with North Korea's provocations too. So I think as this goes by and continues, I don't think there is much South Korea can get from China. I mean, we expected China to some roles in denuclearizing North Korea, but China is actually, supporting North Korea at the UN Security Council resolution issues. And Chinese industries are actually competing with now the South Korean companies. China is not anymore a huge market for South Korean industry that used to be before. So I think, the current trend, I think, would continue in the future in a way that South Korea would not have much to get from China economically. So what can we get from China? Maybe there's not much attraction that we can expect from China in the future.
Right, I see. Moving forward, Michelle, there is talk that the Yoon administration's latest solution to the issue of compensation for Korean victims of Japan's wartime forced labor may only last until he or his party, that would be the People Power Party, is in power. Is this a general outlook, do you think, among pundits there in Japan, Michelle?
I actually hear this quite a bit in Japan, these concerns about whether the efforts made by the Yoon administration will stay, whether it has lasting power, staying power, knowing that the government can swing to the other side after his 5-year term ends. And especially if the next president is a Democrat who wants to undo what the President Yoon did, and then do we have a repeat of what we've seen in the past. I hear this quite a bit, and I do think that the switch in governments in Korea, the potential switch in government, contributes to the current credibility gap, the perception of whether whatever President Yoon is doing will be actually upheld by his successors in the future. And I encounter this sort of skepticism even from people who are hopeful for improved relations between the two countries. So I do think it's a big question that President Yoon will have to address moving forward and show to both the Korean public that this is a worthwhile way to go and the right thing to do for the country to do in the long term. And in doing so, he can message to the Japanese that this agreement this time around could face even more of a lasting possibility even after he leaves office. I think it's important to think about how the swing in governments in South Korea is different from what the Japanese are used to. In Japan, the LDP has been in power for almost continuously for about 6 decades. And so politics tends to be more incremental, governing tends to be more stable, whereas it's not the case in South Korea. So I think this definitely is an issue that the Yoon administration will have to face moving forward.
Right. And Professor Kim, what are some of the more immediate tasks, if I may, that need to be tackled as Seoul, Tokyo and Washington seek to strengthen their ties?
I'm not really sure what are the immediate tasks before they cooperate, but rather I would say what are the key agenda for the cooperations. Maybe the most important and urgent issues in 3 countries is U.S. extended deterrence. I mean, Japan and South Korea simultaneously now feel that the U.S. extended deterrence to each country is not very credible. South Korea, because of North Korea having nuclear weapons and undertaking ongoing military provocations, now feel that we are unstable. And President Yoon even mentioned that, South Korea's own, development of its own nuclear weapons, that was what he mentioned, because that pretty much reflects what South Korea's current security situation is about. And Japan, the same. I mean, Japanese government now thinks that the future Taiwan contingency is Japan contingency, and they're worrying about what happens in Taiwan. What if China uses non-strategic nuclear weapons in case of Taiwan contingency? That will be a directly have some negative impact on Japanese island. And does the U.S. have any kinds of responsive measures vis-a-vis Chinese possible use of non-strategic weapons? That is some kinds of concern the Japanese government have. So I think when trilateral cooperation undergoes, I think 3 countries need to talk about how effectively increase the U.S. credibility of extended deterrence to South Korea and Japan altogether.
Right. And Michelle, what are your thoughts regarding the issues of concern between South Korea and Japan as they seek to improve their ties?
Right. I think one of the big issues that I'm watching is whether the 2 sides will keep up this momentum and what that will produce. They could meet and meet and meet, but if it doesn't actually result in the gap closing in any incremental way at all, then I think we'll know the answer of whether this has a prospect of succeeding this time or not. I think making those sorts of gradual, even if incremental ways forward is what we'll be watching in the near term. And the 2 sides have now agreed to resume shuttle diplomacy. There's, if you look at the calendar, it's clear that they're looking at a sequencing of events to show that they are going to continue talks between the 3 countries. President Yoon is going to be going to Washington in April, and then the G7 will be happening in May in Hiroshima. And now there are reports that President Yoon may be invited to attend as an observer. And then there are also reports that President Yoon might invite Prime Minister Kishida to Korea in the summer to sort of keep this sequencing of events going to show that they are continuing dialogue and that it's actually moving forward. I think the issue that Professor Kim mentioned is very important in terms of the U.S. Showing that it is committed to extended deterrence. We can expect this issue to come up during the U.S.-Korea summit or during the state dinner next month. And I think the other issue that we'll be watching in the immediate term is what the 2 sides announced last week. They talked about restoring GSOMIA. They talked about addressing the export control issue, but they didn't actually say what the timeline of that might be, any sort of details of what those discussions would entail. And that's what we're going to be looking for, those details, and that these meetings are not just to meet, but to actually produce some sort of substance.
Right. Professor Kim, I've been asking this particular question, this next question that I'm going to address to you, to quite a number of pundits who've been joining us here on our show since last week. Do you believe that South Korea and Japan have much more to gain by moving beyond their painful history and to looking toward a more future-oriented relationship as claimed by President Yoon Suk-yeol?
Okay, I think, what Japanese government is worrying about is that it is still not a normal state. Being a abnormal state, and in the future, maybe 30 years, 50 years, let's assume that U.S. hegemony is getting weakened, and Japan has to deal with China alone. What Japanese people and government would worry about? It doesn't have a constitution that allows Japanese government to fight as a normal state. And I think that's what Japanese government is worrying about. And South Korea too. Let's assume that someday U.S. hegemony is weakened and South Korea is left alone without the United States in East Asia, in the Korean Peninsula. What do we have to deal with it? I think that's something we are worrying about, and that's one of the situations that we need to think hardly about the cooperation with Japan.
Right, I see. Michelle, a while back, we had the pleasure of hosting former Japanese Prime Minister Yukio Hatoyama here in the studio. He spoke about the importance of a sincere apology first from Japan to South Korea before seeking to advance bilateral ties. That being said, and based on your observations there in Japan, very briefly speaking, Michelle, do you see an apology on the horizon, yet another one perhaps, from Japan to South Korea with regard to its historical aggressions?
That is a very, very big question that I think both sides are very interested in. We know that the Yoon administration is looking for what they've called a quote-unquote comprehensive apology, and yet from the Japanese side, they have stuck with their line that they reaffirm previous cabinets' views when it comes to an apology. And we saw Prime Minister Kishida repeat that line last week as well. He said that he upholds the previous cabinet's positions on the apology, but he didn't actually go into what that apology is or didn't reiterate the content of those agreements in from the past. So far, what the Japanese have said does not quite reach the level of what the Koreans want to see. I don't know if we're going to get there anytime soon, but I will definitely be watching to see what sort of apology, if at all, actually results from the upcoming discussions.
Right, and we will be watching as well. All right, Michelle, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Professor Kim here in the studio, thank you very much for your insights. Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Tuesday.